Hey fishing friends, Keith here at Chicken Thigh Fishing. Today we are going to tear down, clean, lubricate, and reassemble a Mach crush reel from Lou's Fishing. So let's get at it. But before we get cracking, a couple of tips for you that I always include in my reel cleaning videos. First tip is I recommend working on a movable surface. And the reason for that is when you take this reel apart, you're going to have a lot of parts and a lot of small parts. If you don't work on a movable surface and you do this on your kitchen table or counter or something, and then you have to leave in the middle of it for any reason, that could be problematic if you have kids or pets or anything else that's in your house that's going to come by and take it or knock them around. So, unless you want to lose a part, I recommend working on a movable surface like a cookie sheet that I use. And that way, if you have to leave at any time during the middle of your project, you can put it aside. You can put it on top of the fridge, in the basement, wherever you need to put it. Keep it out of harm's way, and then whenever you come back, you can resume your project. It's going to take you at least an hour or so to clean your reel, especially if you're a beginner to it and you haven't done it before. So I recommend that. I also recommend having the manual handy from your reel, because your manual will come with a schematic of the components of your reel, and it's a great thing to refer to, especially again when you're new at doing this, so you can see the layout of your components. Now, if you bought your reel and it comes in a box, you will get a manual and it'll have a schematic of your reel. If not, like if you bought a combo off a shelf in Dick's Sporting Goods or another sporting goods type store, then your reel didn't come in a box. All you have to do is go to the manufacturer's website and you can download and print a schematic of the components of your reel. Definitely comes in handy. And the last thing I recommend is make sure you have your phone available so you can take some photographs along the way. It's very helpful to take photographs at a few different key points during your disassembly. I'll point those out to you. All right, let's get going. The first thing we're going to do when it comes to tearing down our reel is remove the palm side plate. Now you're going to hear me refer to the palm side of the reel and the handle side of the reel, so that's what I'm referring to. First thing we're going to do is remove that palm side plate, and on this reel, on this generation of the Mach crush, it has a spring-loaded pin here. Previous generations had a switch on the bottom of the palm side plate, but this newer generation has a spring-loaded pin, and you just put a fingernail in there, release the spring pressure. That allows you to rotate the palm side plate and remove it and the spool. So now that we have the palm side plate and the spool removed, we can turn our attention to the handle side of the reel, and we're going to remove the handle assembly, the star drag, and the handle side plate. The first thing we're going to do in order to remove the handle assembly is to remove the handle nut retainer screw. After you remove the handle nut retainer screw, you can remove the handle nut retainer itself, and usually that will come off with gravity. But if it doesn't fall off like that, all you got to do is take a screwdriver or other implement and pop it off like that. And that brings us to our handle nut. And in order to remove the handle nut, typically you're going to need a 10mm wrench or a small adjustable wrench or anything you have. But one important thing I want to point out with the handle nut on a bait casting reel. If you are a lefty like I am, that is to say that your handle is on the left-hand side of your reel, it is not right, tight, left, loose. It's the opposite. If your handle is on the right-hand side of your reel, it's normal. But if you're a lefty, it's reversed. So we're going to turn it right to loosen it. Now this is important because if you turn it the wrong direction and you put any amount of force into it, that nut is easy to strip, so you don't want to do that. So just remember that it's reversed if you're a lefty. So once we crack it loose, we can remove the rest of it by hand. And then we can remove the handle. Now when you remove the handle, an important thing to note is that stuck to the back of it is going to be a washer. Now more often than not, that washer sticks to the back of your handle and all you got to do is take it off. But that's kind of important to note, because if you take your handle off and if you don't see a washer on the main gear shaft, that's because it's stuck here. So you want to take that off so you don't have it fall off at some other point and you don't realize where it came from. So in that case, it was stuck to the handle, and we have it right here. Now the next thing we're going to remove is the star drag, and removing the star drag is a simple matter of unscrewing it. So again, we're going to go to the right because it's on the left-hand side of the reel. And that is simply a matter of spinning it off. Now after you remove your star drag, you're going to come into a series of washers. And so we're going to remove those washers one by one, and we're going to keep them in the same order we remove them in, and in the same orientation that we remove them in. The reason you want to keep them in the same orientation is that because after the first washer, the next two washers are curved. They're not flat. One is curved this way, the other is curved this way. And so you want to keep those in the same orientation that you remove them. And when you clean them, you want to keep them in the same orientation. And when we reassemble, you want to keep them in the same orientation. So you put them back on with the curves going the correct way. Following the curved washers, you will have a sleeve washer. And then next you will have the sleeve. Now the sleeve sits down on the main gear shaft, and sometimes you can pop it out here and gravity can work for you. However, if it doesn't come out with you tapping the main gear shaft on your tray or on your hand and it doesn't allow you to grab it, that's not a big deal, because you can simply pop it out when we get to our next step, which is to remove the handle side plate. But the reason I bring it up is because if during the process of removing the handle side plate that sleeve falls out, I want you to know where it came from. So the first thing I try to do is tap it out like this, but depending on the oil and the grit and the grime in there, it may not come out. In this case, it doesn't want to come out, so we're going to take it off when we remove the handle side plate, which is our next step. Now the palm side plate, you remember, had a spring release mechanism to it. Different from the palm side plate, your handle side plate will be held on by screws. And so you will see here that we have 1, 2, 3 screws on the outside of the handle side plate. And we're also going to have 1, 2 screws on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those screws. And now when I remove the screws from the handle side plate, I am going to remove them and lay them down in the same pattern that I removed them from the handle side plate, so we make sure we put them back in the correct holes on reassembly. Now the last screw on the inside has two purposes. It doesn't only hold the body of the reel to the handle side plate, but it also holds in the lubrication port door. And so when you remove that, you're going to want to make sure that you also remove the lubrication port door itself, because if you don't remove that little hatch, you're not going to be able to remove the handle side plate. So when you take that screw out, you also want to remove that port door. So now I have the 3 screws removed from the exterior side, and I have the 2 screws and the lubrication port door removed from the inside, and that will allow me to carefully lift off the handle side plate. I'm going to use a screwdriver to prop up the reel there so it doesn't fall over. And now once you have the handle side plate removed, we can go back to the sleeve that I was talking about. And it's stuck in the clutch right there. And all you have to do is push that out from one side, and then you can remove it from the other side. Now, one very important thing to note about the sleeve is that at first glance it looks like it has identical ends, but it does not. One end is perfectly circular and the other end has two straight sides in the shape of like an oblong rectangle. You want to make sure that you're aware of that. That it's kind of subtle, but if you look at it you can see it. And you want to make sure the end with the two straight sides goes up when it comes time for reassembly. And now we can take the handle side plate and place it aside. And you'll see that I laid the screws out in the pattern they go back in. So I know this screw goes here, this screw goes here, and this screw goes here, because they're the outside screws. And I put the two inside screws on this side, and we have the one single screw and then the screw that goes with the lubrication port door here. Just makes it a little easier when it comes time for reassembly, because a lot of times on bait casting reels you're going to have different length and different diameter screws, and if you mix them up when you disassemble, it just saves you time when it comes time for reassembling from trying to put the wrong screw in the wrong hole. So now the next step is going to be to remove the interior components. Now this is the first point where I would say it's probably a good idea, especially if you haven't done this before, to take a photograph of this. That way you get a record of the orientation, so when it comes time for reassembly, if something doesn't look right or feel right, you can refer to the photograph you took, and or you can refer to the schematic of the components. But it's always helpful to have a photograph, so I'd recommend taking a photograph here. Now the first thing we're going to remove here is the yoke and the pinion gear. First thing we're going to do is remove the two springs that are on the yoke posts. And then we can grab the top of the pinion gear and lift up the pinion gear and the yoke, and you may have to just tilt the main gear a little bit so you can work that out of there. Now the pinion gear and the yoke, they mate with one another in the middle. You'll see that the pinion gear has a wider side and a thinner side, and then it has a groove in the middle. The wider side goes down, the thinner side goes up, and the middle section where it has that groove is where it mates with the yoke. So we're going to remove that yoke and the pinion gear, and then we will be ready to remove the main gear and the drag washer assembly. Now when you remove the main gear assembly, sometimes you're going to get a little resistance and you may have to use a little bit of pressure to pop it up. If you do, that's fine, just don't use a tremendous amount of pressure, because you don't want to really pull on that and then have it go free, and then you end up sending a washer flying across your table. Also, when we begin to lift the assembly off of the main gear shaft, we want to put a finger underneath it, because there's going to be components stuck to the bottom of it. And you don't want those to fall out and not know the order that they go in. So as you can see, I put my finger underneath there and I held it like a sandwich, because there's multiple components in here. And underneath, stuck to the bottom of the main gear, we're going to find the ratchet and a washer. And the reason those stick there is because of oil and dirt that are inside. Typically, you're going to have that happen. If they don't stick, then they will simply be on the bottom of the gear shaft here. But 9 times out of 10, they're going to stick there. And so now that we have those two components removed from the bottom, we're going to go ahead and remove the drag washers. And when I remove each one, I'm going to make sure there's not another one stuck to it, so I make sure I don't miss a component. There's going to be a series of washers in here, and typically it's going to go from metal to a carbon fiber washer, then a metal, and then a carbon fiber. and I'm going to lay those components out in the order that they go in. Now, one important thing to note in this assembly is the ratchet. You will see here that the ratchet has teeth that face in a certain direction. You want to be cognizant of the orientation of the direction that those teeth face. They face to the left. And the reason they face to the left is because when that ratchet is on the main gear shaft, the job of that ratchet is to engage with the click lever. And you can see that when you press on the thumb release button, the click lever will go into place, and you will see how the teeth engage with that click lever. So if you had that inverted with the teeth facing the opposite way, it does not work properly. And you'll find that out as soon as you put together if you put that on the wrong way, because your thumb release and the click lever will not work properly and the ratchet will not engage with it. So when you remove and when you clean and when you replace that ratchet, you want to make sure that you keep the teeth in the correct orientation. I've done it before. You're in a kind of a hurry or whatnot, or you're not aware of that situation, and you end up putting the ratchet on with the teeth facing the incorrect direction. You put your whole reel together, then you have to disassemble all over again just to get down to this ratchet and flip it over and put it in the correct direction. So you want to be aware of the direction that those teeth face. Once we have the drag washer and the gear assembly off, the next thing we're going to remove is the main gear shaft and the bearing plate assembly. That's held on by 2 screws here, and this metal piece that goes underneath the gear is the bearing plate, and underneath that is a bearing. This might be another good time to take a photograph so you can see the orientation of the bearing plate, so you don't try to put that on backwards when it comes time for reassembly. You're going to notice that the bearing plate has a curve in it here that coincides with the curve of the gear shaft hole. So we'll go ahead and remove those 2 screws in order to remove the gear shaft. So once the screws are removed, it's simply a matter of lifting the gear shaft off. Now you will see here that this assembly consists of the gear shaft, the bearing plate, a bearing, and the gear shaft gear. And these are held together by an E-clip here. That's what holds all those components together. Now you can break this down into all those individual components if you like. However, it's not necessary because you can clean and lubricate them effectively while keeping them together. And I just like to take apart as few components as possible in order to get a good cleaning and lubrication. So I usually leave the main gear shaft assembly together as a unit. Now we're done on the handle side. We don't need to break this down any further. So what we're going to do is move to the front of the reel, and we're going to remove the level wind gear and the worm drive assembly. The first step in doing that is to remove the hood. Now the hood is going to be held on by a screw on the palm side and a screw on the handle side. So we'll go ahead and remove those 2 screws. Now when I remove those 2 screws, I'm going to be aware of which side each one came from because they are 2 different screws. So I laid this down here because it goes on the left side as the reel is facing me, and I laid this one down here because it goes on the right side as the reel is facing me. And then I am going to carefully remove the hood and lay that down like so. This screw goes on this side, this screw goes on this side. Now once you remove the hood, you want to be aware that the hood holds in place the pillar. The pillar is a shaft of metal that goes through the level wind guide. And the hood, the ear on that hood holds it in place. So if you were to turn this after you remove the hood, that's going to fall out just like it did there, and you're not going to know where it came from if you haven't done this before. So once you remove the hood, I would suggest putting your hand on the handle side of the reel so that that pillar doesn't fall out. Now that's going to be the next component that we remove anyway, but I want you to be aware of that in case once you remove that hood that the pillar falls out. Now the pillar can only go in and come out one way, and you'll see that it goes in and out of the handle side of the reel. And the reason for that is because the pillar has a nub on one end of it that is a smaller diameter than the rest of the pillar. And because of that, the holes on either side of the housing of the reel are different sizes. The one hole is big enough for the entire diameter of the pillar to fit through, and the other hole is a smaller diameter because it's where that little nub sits when you put it in. So the pillar only goes in from the handle side of the reel through the hole in the level wind guide, and then the nub seats into that side. So I'm going to remove that pillar and I'm going to lay it down in the orientation that it goes in. Now after we have the hood and the pillar removed, we are going to be able to remove the level wind guide and the worm drive assembly. On one side you're going to have a gear and a pin, and on the other side you're going to have a bushing and a spacer and an E-clip. And now that E-clip holds the entire assembly together, so the first thing we're going to do is remove that E-clip in order to disassemble this assembly. So on the palm side of the reel we are going to remove the E-clip, and we're going to do that by putting a small screwdriver or other implement into one of the notches on the E-clip like this, and then we're just going to pop it off. But one thing you want to be acutely aware of is usually when you pop an E-clip off of something, there's a certain amount of force that goes with it. You want to make sure you cover this with your hand, because if not, when you pop that E-clip off, it could go flying across the room, and if it does, good luck finding it. So I'm going to put my hand over the E-clip and pop it off. And so you'll see that it bounced off my hand when I popped it off, and it went inside the reel. And so I'm going to stick the E-clip over here, because as I'm looking at the reel, it's on the palm side, it's on this side. Now underneath the E-clip you're going to have a spacer typically, but I don't see a spacer here. And so here you're going to have a bushing. If you do have a spacer, it will just be a small, very thin copper spacer. And so we're going to take that bushing out and place that underneath the E-clip. So now that we have the palm side of the worm drive disassembled, I'm going to go ahead and remove the cap from the level wind guide, and that's simply a matter of unscrewing it. And if it's on too tight for you to unscrew by hand, there is a slot for a slotted screwdriver. And we're going to remove the cap, and inside the cap is going to be a pawl, and that's a small piece of metal that engages the level wind guide with the worm drive. And the easiest way to remove that is simply with gravity and let it fall into your hand. Now typically there is another spacer in there, and it usually either sticks to the top of the pawl or inside the cap, and in this case it's inside the cap, so I'm just going to leave it inside the cap. But if you have a really small spacer there, that's where that goes. And so now you'll see that the level wind guide is free because it's no longer engaged with the worm drive. So now I can begin to remove the worm drive tube from the handle side, and as I pull it out, it's going to free up the level wind guide. And so I will just grab that level wind guide, and I'm going to lay down the worm drive so I can show you here. The level wind guide has a large hole which accommodates the worm drive tube. It has a small hole which accommodates the pillar, and then on the face of it, the lower hole is where the pawl and the cap go, and the upper hole is the line guide that your fishing line goes through. So now I'm going to go ahead and get that worm drive, and the worm drive is in the tube, and now that it's loose I can push this gear down, and what that's going to reveal is the pin that holds that gear into position. Now this is quite a small pin, you can either grab it out or it'll fall out with gravity, or you can grab it with a pair of tweezers. And I just poked it out there. And so we're going to put that pin over here, and you can see how small it is. And that pin frees up the worm gear. Once the worm gear is removed, I can now remove the worm drive from the worm drive tube. And that only goes in one way. And you'll see that I can pull it out this way. Now, when you go to reassemble this, it's only going to go in one way, but an easy way to remember it is that one end of the worm drive has a hole in it, and that hole accommodates the pin that secures the gear. So if you remember that that gear goes on the handle side of the body, you can just lay it down and know that that's the correct orientation for that component. Now, in the worm drive tube, you're going to have a bearing, and you can just pop that bearing out, and that bearing goes underneath the gear, and then you have the worm drive tube. Now, it's important to note that the worm drive tube can be inserted on either side of the body of the reel. But it's important to note that one end of it is lipped and the other end is not. And you want to be sure to be aware that the lipped end goes on the handle side of the reel. So when you insert this, you're going to insert it from the handle side to the palm side. And the reason is because that lip forms a cup that the bearing goes into and that then the gear sits on top of. So again, I'm going to take that out with the reel facing me in the orientation that I'm going to replace it in when it comes time for reassembly. And so now you'll see here that I have the pillar, the worm drive, and the worm drive tube. And on this side we have the bushing and the E-clip, and on this side we have the bearing, the gear, and the gear pin. And so now that's as far as we're going to disassemble this reel. The reel has many, many more parts to it, but there is no reason to break it down any further in order to achieve a routine maintenance, cleaning, and lubrication. So now that we have our reel disassembled and our components laid out in an organized and methodical fashion, you may want to take a photograph of this, so in the event that you were to tip your cookie sheet over or somebody was to bump into it and the parts got all mixed up, you would have a photograph of it so you could put them back in the correct location just to make it easier for you upon reassembly. So now we're going to go ahead and clean the individual components. Now, if you ask 100 people, you'll get 100 different answers as to the best product to use or the best way to clean the parts of a reel. I simply use Lysol or Clorox wipes, and they've always worked terrific for me. They get everything cleaned and they don't do any harm to the parts. But if you have a different method or you want to try something different, there's plenty of other products out there that you can use to clean the parts. I use these cleaning wipes. So I'm simply going to go through in a methodical manner, pick up, clean, and lay back down in the same orientation each individual component. Okay, so we're finished cleaning all the individual components, and you'll see that this wasn't a very dirty reel at all. In fact, I had recently cleaned this reel. So you got some of the old grease and oil on here, and you can tell that the grease is still bluish green. So it was new grease. So if you have a dirty reel, you're going to get significantly more amount of dirt and grime and pieces of foreign objects, grass, you name it, stuff that gets in there. This is a clean reel, but typically it's going to be a lot dirtier than that. And so now we will go ahead and begin our reassembly and lubrication of the reel. And for the most part, what we're going to do is put things back together in reverse order that we disassembled them in. And so I'm going to do that primarily with the reel housing facing me. That is to say, with the front of the reel facing me, especially for the beginning part where we replace the worm drive and the level wind assemblies. So the first thing we're going to do is to take that worm drive tube, and remember it's going to go in the handle side of the reel with that lipped end on the handle side of the reel. Then I can take my level wind guide, and remember it has that larger hole to accommodate the worm drive tube. And we are going to put the worm drive tube through the level wind guide, and then the other end of the worm drive tube simply seats into the corresponding hole on the other side of the body of the reel, and you can usually hear that and feel that click into place. And now it's not uncommon that when we're putting this together that end will slip out. All you got to do is put it back in. It's really not a big deal if that smaller end of the worm drive tube slips out. So now that I have the tube in, we are going to replace the worm drive. Now remember, the worm drive only goes in one way. If you try to put it in the other way, it won't go in, so you know which way it goes in. And remember, it has the hole on the handle side of the reel to accommodate the pin. So we're going to go ahead and slide the worm drive into the worm drive tube. And then we're going to be able to assemble the handle side components of the worm drive assembly, starting with that bearing that goes over the worm drive itself and into the cup on the lipped end of the worm drive. Once I have that bearing in place, I'm going to go ahead and hit that with a drop of reel oil. And then I am going to replace the worm gear. Now, an important thing to note on the worm gear is one side of it has grooves on the top, on the surface of it. And the grooves are where that pin fits. If you flip it over, you'll see that the other side of it is flat. So you want the grooved end going up or outside of the reel. That way the pin will have the place it needs to go to be seated into. And so you want to make sure that the end of the worm drive is extended enough out so you can see that hole, because that hole is where you're going to drop that pin. And now once you get that pin into the worm drive, all you're going to do is manipulate that down so that the pin drops into the grooves on top of the worm drive gear. And again, usually during that process, this end of the worm tube is going to slip out of that hole. So while holding that in place, you just want to put it back in. Now you're going to want to make sure that you now hold this with your finger when you tip it over to do the palm side, because if you don't, when you tip it over to do the palm side, that pin and gear are likely going to fall out. So what we'll do is we'll move over to the palm side where we will replace the bushing. And now that bushing has a rectangular little nub on it that only allows it to fit in here one way. So you want to make sure that that rectangular nub is right in where it goes. And then you can take the E-clip and put that into position to secure the bushing. And now once you have that in position, you want to go ahead and grab a small slotted screwdriver and put a little pressure on the edge of it. And then once you put the pressure on, you can release the other end. And then we're going to pop that on. But again, we're going to cover that with our hand when we do so. If you don't cover your hand and you pop that on and you miss, or it kind of glances off the side of that shaft, it's going to go flying. So now we have the handle side of the worm drive assembled with the gear, the bearing underneath it, and then the pin. And then we have the bushing and the E-clip replaced on this side. And so now you'll see that the level wind guide is on the worm drive tube, but it's not engaged with the worm drive. And for that, we're going to reinsert the pawl. And now that pawl has two small ears on it, and those ears go down and they engage in the grooves in the worm drive. And typically when you drop that in, the top edge of the pawl is going to be sticking out. All you have to do is rotate it, and you'll see that it fell in because those ears on the pawl fell into the grooves. So now with the pawl inserted into the level wind guide, you can replace the cap, and you can tweak it with a screwdriver if you wish. And once that pawl is in there and engaged with the worm drive, you'll see that you can no longer move it side to side because it's engaged. So the next step is we will engage the level wind guide so it doesn't tilt back and forth. And the way we do that is with the pillar. Now you will recall the pillar only goes in one way. It has the one end that has the nub on it. And we're going to insert it through the handle side of the reel, through the hole. So you see there it goes right through the level wind guide. And then you'll see the nub on the end of it seats into the smaller hole on the palm side of the reel. And you just have to manipulate that nub into position. And you'll know it's in the correct position when this side is flush. So if this side is flush, you know it's properly seated in there. Now remember that that pillar is held in place by the hood. So until you put the hood on, if you turn this one way, that pillar will fall out again. So now that we have the pillar installed, we're going to go ahead and replace the hood to keep that in place. And you'll see here that this section of the hood is what covers the end of that pillar. So now the end of the pillar is covered and the hood is holding it in place. And so now we can take the two screws that hold the hood in place and replace those screws. So now we have the hood, the level wind guide, and the worm drive assemblies all reattached. Next thing we can do is move over to the handle side components of the reel. And the first thing we're going to do is replace the main gear shaft and the bearing plate assembly. And remember, the curved section of this bearing plate corresponds with the curve of the pinion gear hole. Prior to installing it, we'll hit that with a drop of reel oil. And we can get that into position and line up the holes for the screws. And you will see that the lower gear meshes with the worm drive gear. So now we'll take the two screws that hold the bearing plate in place and reinsert those. Next, we will replace the yoke and the pinion gear. Now remember, the pinion gear had the wider side and it had the thinner side, and the middle of it fits into the yoke, and the wider side of the pinion gear goes down. So once we engage those two, we can hold them together and drop the yoke down onto the two yoke posts. And you will see that that slides down nicely onto the posts. Now you should have this length of about 1/4 of an inch of the posts that stick up, because that has to accommodate the two springs that go on the yoke posts. So in the event that you put the yoke on and there's not enough post sticking up in order to put those springs on, you know that you put the yoke on upside down, so all you have to do is flip that over. Now you want to make sure you remember to put the yoke springs back on those posts, because that's an easy item to forget, and I've done it on multiple occasions over the years, where I put my whole reel together and reassemble it, and then when I'm done, I see two springs sitting in the corner of my cookie sheet here, and then I have to disassemble all the way to get down to those posts just to put those springs on. So you want to remember to put those springs on at this point. And now we're ready for the drag washer and the main gear assembly, beginning with the ratchet. And now the ratchet has an oblong rectangular shape in the middle, and it fits onto the base of the main gear shaft. So we'll drop that down and make sure that is seated accordingly. And we'll also make sure that those teeth are facing to the left. Remember, they have to be able to engage with the kick lever. Next is this washer, and then the main gear. Now when you put the main gear on, it may slide right into place, but it engages with the pinion gear. So in order to fit it down, you may have to tip the pinion gear a little bit just to get it down there. And then you can click it down into place, and you can see how it engages with the pinion gear. So when you have achieved that, you know you're good. Then we will place the drag washers back into the main gear in the same order that they were removed. Now with the weight of that on there, it's going to tip over, so I'm going to prop it up again. And here is where I'm going to grease the gears. So I'll take my real grease and I will apply a thin coat of grease along the outside of the main gear. And now you don't have to put a ton of grease on. Matter of fact, you don't want to put too much, because grease attracts dirt, but you want enough there to have the gears sufficiently lubricated. And so I just put a little bit of grease there like that. And then when those gears mesh, that will disperse the grease sufficiently. So now that we have the main gear and the drag washer assembly on, we can move to begin the washer assembly, starting with the sleeve. Now remember, that sleeve has one circular end and one oblong rectangular end. The one with the straight sides, the rectangular end, goes up, facing the outside of the reel. The circular end goes down. Now the next washers aren't going to go on until after we reinstall the handle side plate. Now the handle side plate, you recall, has the spring-loaded pin in order to release the palm side plate. And so that goes into the corresponding hole, so you just have to line that up. But before we replace it, I'm going to go ahead and oil the bearing and the clutch. And then line that up and go ahead and seat that down. Now you'll feel a little bit of tension from those two springs, but not too much. And now here's where it comes into play with the pattern of the screws, so you make sure you put the screws back in the same holes. So these 3 screws will go here on the outside, and these 2 screws will go on the back side, including the lubrication port door. And so now we have the handle side plate reinstalled with all the screws in the correct holes. Next thing we can do is begin to replace the washers, beginning with the sleeve washer and then the 2 curved washers. And you want to keep those in the same orientation like we talked about, so those curves are facing the correct way. Then the star drag washer. And sometimes these washers, especially this washer, can be a little difficult to get down because it's got that rectangular shape that corresponds with the shape of the gear shaft here. And so you just have to kind of force it a little bit over those threads sometimes, like so. And once we have those washers, we're ready for the star drag. Now the star drag is just a simple matter of screwing it on. And I'm just going to hit the inside of that with a drop of reel oil and then place it on the main gear shaft. And now getting the first thread onto the star drag can take you a minute sometimes because of the shape of the inside of it. You want to make sure that it goes on nice and easily. And once you get that first thread on, you'll know it's on correctly with by the ease with which it spins. So it should spin like that. If it doesn't spin that easily, if you encounter any resistance in screwing it on, you know you have it cross-threaded and it's not on properly, and you want to stop what you're doing, remove it, and start over again, because it's easy to strip the inside of that star drag. So you want to make sure that it goes on nice and easily. Now when it gets down to the star drag washer, when you turn it, it's going to want to move the worm drive assembly. And so once it stops, you'll be able to tighten it down. And if it still wants to move it, just put your finger on there and hold it in place. And you can put that down. Okay, with the star drag in place, we can put on the handle washer. And then the handle. Once the handle is in place, we can put the handle nut on, and again you're going to want to be sure of that first thread. The rectangular shape of the gear shaft can make it a little difficult to get that first thread on correctly. So again, you just want to make sure it spins very freely. If there's resistance, that's because it's cross-threaded, so you want to stop, remove it, and start over again. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to snug it down. Not too tight, but just snug. You do not want to over tighten your handle nut. And then once the handle nut is on, I can replace the handle nut retainer. And now the hole in the handle nut retainer has to align with the hole in the handle in order for the screw to go in. Now 9 times out of 10, you're not going to be able to line that up exactly. So once you get it on, you just want to tweak your handle nut to the right or the left in order to line those two holes up. Because if they're not lined up perfectly, that handle nut retainer screw isn't going to go in. So we'll take the handle nut retainer screw now that we have the holes lined up, and we can replace that. So now we're done with the handle side. And we can move over to the palm side, where I'm just going to put a drop of oil down there near the pinion gear. And then I'm going to replace the spool. But prior to replacing the spool, I will oil the spool bearing. And then I can replace the spool. And our last component will be our palm side plate, which also has a bearing. And that bearing is for the external magnetic brake dial. And so once we have that oiled, we can simply click the palm side plate into place. And there you have it, my friends. Clean, smooth, quiet, ready to go, like new. Cleaned and lubricated. Make sure everything works. Test your thumb release. If you press down your thumb release and the handle does not engage it, you know you put that ratchet on backwards. You got to take it all the way apart, get down to that ratchet, flip it over so those teeth are facing the correct way. I've done it before. One clean and lubricated Mach crush bait casting reel from Luz Fishing. Hey, I hope this video was a help to you if you own this particular reel and you want to save yourself some time and money and clean and lubricate it yourself rather than sending it out to somebody else. If you like this video, hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate you being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing. We'll see you in the next video, folks. And until then, stay fishing, my friends.